What happens when you enter one of the most haunted rooms in the world is the subject of today's story. Even though this specific story was written 200 years ago, the lore around what occurs in that room is still very much alive today. Before we get into that story, though, if you enjoy the strange, dark, and mysterious presented in narrative form, you've come to the correct spot. We upload once a week and specialize in that genre. Therefore, if that interests you, please enter the like button's bathroom covertly and use Novocaine in place of their toothpaste. To ensure you don't miss any of our weekly uploads, please subscribe to our channel and enable all notifications. All right, let's begin the story for today. On the front porch of a townhouse in one of the most upscale areas of London, England, a 30-year-old British aristocrat named Sir Robert Warboys stood beside 5 of his closest friends, late one evening in 1840. This townhouse, which was located at 50 Berkeley Square, was one of dozens of lovely townhouses made of marble and brick that encircled this large lawn. Since the square's construction around a century ago, it has developed into one of the most exclusive residences for the wealthy and well-known. But Robert and his companions had not come here to mingle with high-ranking officials. Robert had come here to win a bet. Instead, Robert was, in fact, a nobleman. On paper, he seemed like this proper man, but in truth, he had a completely crazy streak, at least to his buddies. He enjoyed accepting challenges. In essence, he would comply with whatever challenge he was given, particularly if money was involved. However, the money wasn't the main factor. The goal was not to make money by engaging in these many activities. He simply adored the challenge. He enjoyed the rush of taking risks. So that evening, Robert turned and banged on the front door from the front porch of this townhouse. As soon as he had finished, he turned around and smiled towards his friends. And he noticed that some of them appeared somewhat anxious, while others were quite eager. However, Robert was simply content with the way things were going thus far, since he knew that he would have a fantastic story to share tomorrow after everything was finished and he had won his wager. The townhouse's front door opened a few seconds later, and this middle-aged man emerged. Charles Benson was his name. Furthermore, Charles and Robert were not close friends, even though they did know one another. Actually, the only reason they knew one another was that they were both members of the same upscale London gentlemen's club. Additionally, Charles was well known in London due to the numerous rumours that circulated about what transpired in his townhouse. Charles appeared somewhat shocked to see Robert standing there, despite the fact that Robert had made it obvious that he and his friends were coming to his townhouse for this wager this evening. Nevertheless, Robert said, "Hey Charles, how are you?" "I'm here for the wager." You know, Charles essentially did not respond. He just responded, "Are you sure you really want to do this?" while maintaining a very worried expression on his face. Robert, who understood what he was talking about, simply glanced down at the revolver he was carrying and responded, "Yeah, I'm sure." Charles had gone upstairs to grab something, and a few minutes later, Robert and his 5 friends were seated around a table in the dining room of his townhouse. Robert glanced around the room at his pals as they sat there, and he could see that they were obviously more anxious about this than he was. He attempted to lighten the atmosphere by cracking jokes and downplaying what he was going to do. However, he could see his pals were somewhat anxious about what was going to happen here, no matter what he did. The sound of Charles coming down the stairs was then heard a moment later. You know, Charles still had a really serious expression on his face as he entered the kitchen. When he approached them, he took an old iron key out of his pocket and set it in the center of the table. The room fell silent as soon as he finished, and everyone just stared at the key. Charles finally broke the ice and told the group that he had only used that key perhaps 2 or 3 times in the 10 years that he had lived in this townhouse. Charles added that he really concealed the key while it wasn't being used to ensure it didn't get up in the wrong hands. But now, once more, with that solemn expression on his face, Charles turned to face Robert and said, "You can take the key if you're really certain about this." Without hesitation, Robert reached out and grabbed the key, demonstrating to Charles and his pals that he was not going to change his mind. Charles led the company up the tiny, slender, creaking staircase to the second story after the guys had all gotten up from the dining room table a few minutes earlier. Charles guided them down the slender corridor that ended in front of this closed door when they reached the second floor. By this time, the 7 men were gathered somewhat in front of this entrance. However, it was clear that despite living in this townhouse, Charles was rather reluctant to approach this door, as if he truly didn't want to be in the vicinity. Additionally, Robert's buddies were all responding somewhat in the same manner. They actually dared Robert to do this in the first place after all. However, they were staring at Robert as if he were completely crazy now that they were here and ready to carry out the plan. Additionally, they were hopeful that perhaps he would simply change his mind and they could simply depart. However, Robert didn't give the impression that he was going to change his mind. He was wearing a really determined expression. While everyone else was sort of scuttling away from this door, Robert took a step forward, took the iron key out of his pocket, and inserted it into the lock. And everyone else moved away from him as he started to turn the lock. Then he yanked the door open, and everyone gasped as he did, and Robert even retreated a step. However, Robert simply laughed when he peeked through the now open doorway, because it was just a typical bedroom. It was crammed with antique furnishings that looked really costly. There was a large round mirror above a large oak dresser on one side of the room. Then there was this large 4-poster bed on the other side of the room, and there was this crimson ribbon hanging from the ceiling directly above this bed. Robert now knew that ribbons like this one, called bell pulls, were used in the homes of wealthy noblemen. That lever, which was attached to a pulley system that rang a bell down in the servants' quarters, was pullable by a nobleman. Upon hearing the bell, the servant would identify the apartment from which it originated and proceed to the room to see what the nobleman required. Robert then walked confidently into the bedroom after assessing its appearance. "Hey, Robert, this is your last chance to change your mind," Charles shouted, grabbing him by the wrist as soon as he did. "Do you really want to follow through on this?" "I'm sure," Robert answered with a smile as he kind of turned to face his companions. "Once I've won the wager, I'll see you all in the morning." Robert then let go of Charles's wrist, entered the room, turned and locked the door. Robert's buddies were at a loss for what to do. At this point, they were still a little taken aback that Robert was really carrying out this plan. This felt especially careless even by his standards. They also experienced some guilt. After all, it was they who finally subjected him to this. Therefore, it would be partly their fault if Robert was injured, which theoretically could happen here. Robert's pals then looked to Charles to find out his thoughts, and the look on Charles's face was one of resignation and graveness. He simply said, "Before we go to bed, I have one more thing to show you." In order to get to the very rear of the townhouse, Robert's pals followed Charles back along the hall, past the dining room, and down the stairs. When they arrived, they saw that the space behind them resembled a studio apartment. A washing room, a kitchen, and multiple beds were all present. Charles clarified that although this was the residence and workplace of his workers, he had granted them all the night off because he was aware that Robert and his companions might be present for this wager and would want lodging. Charles indicated an area directly over the beds where a horizontal row of bells was located. These bells were all attached to different bell poles around the home, and he indicated to them that the bell in the room where Robert was staying tonight was the one attached to the bell pole. He went on to say that it was their responsibility to keep an eye on the bell all night long. Tonight, heaven forbid, if Robert rang that bell, it would be an indication that something terrible had occurred in that chamber, so someone had to be up all night listening to it. Therefore, their main responsibility was to remain vigilant throughout the night in case Robert needed to be rescued. We released our first graphic novel last year, and everything went perfectly. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. After all, I sincerely appreciate you all making that possible. However, since the publication of this book, we have been inundated with inquiries regarding when you plan to create another graphic novel. When will the second book be published? I must make an announcement, though. Take a look. A second graphic novel is in the works. The official cover art is this as well. Here it is. Where Nightmares Live is presented by Mr. Balin. There will be 9 more thrilling, bizarre, sinister, and enigmatic stories in it. It is released on September 30th. However, if you visit bookbollinstudios.com, you may place a pre-order for it right now. Additionally, a link may be found in the paragraph below and right here. Signed copies are available, but they won't last long. To pre-order a copy of our most recent graphic novel, please visit bookbollinstudios.com. I'm sure you'll adore it. Take a look. Your nightmares are just around the corner. 3 hours or so later, Robert's companions were all playing blackjack on the floor in the servants' quarters. Even though they were all worn out and it was almost midnight, they couldn't sleep because they were too tense. In addition to being preoccupied with this bell, they were also somewhat concerned about Robert and wondered if he was truly all right up there. Additionally, they had grown to believe that if they were creating too much noise, perhaps the bell might ring and they wouldn't hear it. Thus, they had decided to play blackjack in silence and concentrate only on this bell. However, it had actually increased the level of tension in the space. They are all essentially simply staring at the bell, dealing one hand after another, wondering what would happen if it did go off, and being paranoid that it might. As a result, the pals are playing blackjack hand after hand, while nervously observing this bell that is entirely silent. They all jump when they hear this sound out of nowhere. It wasn't the bell, though. The scream emanating from upstairs was spine-tingling. The friends just sat there in disbelief for a while. Then they rose and started to rush out of the servants' quarters to find out what was happening. As they were doing so, Robert's bell started ringing so loudly that it was hurting their ears. Thus they dash from the servants' quarters and literally run into Charles, who is also arriving, to ascertain what is happening. They then start racing together up the stairs to the second floor. Meanwhile, the bell is ringing frantically. Robert's bedroom is the source of the screaming. Everything abruptly fell silent by the time they reached the second story. The ringing ceased, the yelling ceased. It is really quiet in that hallway, which is on the second story, and that closed door is up ahead of them. Without knowing what to anticipate, Charles and the group start down the hall. They hear a big bang just as they get to the door, and then there is silence once more. Since Robert was the only one with the key, his pals were at the door a few seconds later, beating on it and yelling for him to come open it. But there was no sound coming from Robert. There was still no sound in the room. The pals finally start kicking on this door in an attempt to get it to open. Charles is observing this terrible event from the back of the corridor the entire time. At last, the pals are able to physically kick the door in. It's a century-old house, after all. The buddies stagger into the room when the door is kicked in, then turn to face the bedroom. They all simply freeze in disbelief. 10 years ago, when Charles purchased this townhouse, it had a very sinister past. It appears that the previous owner had kept his aggressive and insane brother imprisoned in this bedroom on the second level, which is where Robert was, and all of these weird and terrifying things started happening in this room after this sibling passed away there. When no one was there, people started to hear these terrible sobbing noises emanating from this room. The wailing would stop when they entered the room. However, despite the fact that once more no one had been in the room to do so, furniture had been moved throughout the space. Additionally, others started to notice this vague grey figure moving around the room, particularly at night, slinking across the floor and up against the wall. And it simply felt like evil, even if no one knew what it was. They then started referring to it as the nameless thing and the physical manifestation of evil. But not everyone took this narrative seriously. Robert Warboys, in fact, was one individual who did not accept the narrative at all. He believed this to be a fanciful story meant to frighten people. He gladly accepted his friend's challenge to spend a night in the bedroom where the nameless thing was said to reside, because it didn't seem dangerous to him at all. Since the haunted room isn't truly haunted, spending a night there wasn't a huge concern. He would be all right. In any case, that would be a fascinating tale to share at the Gentleman's Club. The night in that bedroom, however, did not turn out the way Robert had intended. The bell pole was the first thing Robert's buddies saw when they rushed through the bedroom door and peered inside. Robert's pistol lay on the floor beside the bed, and the ribbon from the ceiling had been wrenched out. There was also a noticeable gunshot hole in the wall on the opposite side of the room. As they were making their way down the hall, they heard a huge bang. The pistol was exploding. Then there was Robert. In fact, Robert was still holding on to the red ribbon from the bell pole while he lay on the bed, completely rigid. As they gazed at him, they noticed that his eyes were bloodshot and wide open, and that his lips were somewhat drawn back in a terrible grimace that showed his fangs. For a moment, his pals believed Robert was experiencing some sort of seizure. He was very tight on the bed. Because of this, they rushed to him in an attempt to wake him up. However, they discovered that he was not experiencing a seizure when they touched him. Robert's death was the reason. The local coroner would come over and remove Robert's body after Charles called him that evening. In order to determine what had occurred to Robert, he would also hold a formal inquiry into his death. The inquest's conclusion was that Robert had passed away from severe heart failure brought on by unidentified causes. However, it was evident to Charles and all of Robert's companions who were present that evening and saw Robert in the chamber that he had come into contact with the so-called unnamed object there, and he was genuinely terrified by it. 50 Berkeley Square has been owned by numerous people in the over 200 years since Robert's passing. Additionally, almost all of them have claimed to have seen, felt, or heard a hostile spectral presence in that bedroom on the second floor. That specific bedroom where the unnamed creature reportedly inhabits is still regarded as one of the most haunted locations on Earth. Okay, till the next occasion. See you later.